This is entirely predictable, I would say. But where does this leave us in where this war now is, do you think?
I think these attacks had zero effect on the outcome of the war. These were pinpricks at the most. The idea that these attacks have shifted the balance of power in any meaningful way is not a serious argument. My guess is that they probably destroyed or...
On Piers Morgan Uncensored, explosive tensions rise as John Mearsheimer and Ian Bremmer clash over the Ukraine war's true impact, the audacity of drone strikes inside Russia, and the terrifying nuclear brinkmanship lurking beneath the surface. Is Western support for Ukraine misguided? Are nuclear war fears justified or alarmist? Let's break this down.
Crippled somewhere on the order of 4 or 5 aircraft. But how's that going to affect this war? It's just not going to have any effect. What really matters here, and what people are not talking about enough, is the fact that the Ukrainians struck at Russian strategic nuclear forces. They hit one leg of the nuclear triad. Now, they only destroyed a handful of bombers, but the mere fact that they went after Russian strategic nuclear forces is downright scary.
This exposes the razor-thin line Ukraine is playing by targeting Russia's nuclear assets, a move fraught with global risk and unintended escalation.
And lots of people have made that point very clearly in the higher levels of the administration. And I believe, by the way, Piers, this is why President Trump called President Putin on June 4th. You remember the attacks took place on June 1st. I think that Trump was scared that the Russians would do something that would cause a lot of trouble simply because the Ukrainians, who we were surely helping, hit Russian strategic nuclear forces, hit one leg of their nuclear triad. But in terms of the actual war and what's happening here, this is a meaningless attack.
Well, you say meaningless. I mean, there's been reports that it could have been as many as 24 aircraft hit, each valued at $100 million. That's not meaningless. And I would secondly say the more significant aspect of it was humiliating for Putin, who would never have seen this coming, must have been deeply shocked at the scale of the raid and how successful it was. So notwithstanding the fact that you're probably right, it doesn't really change the bigger picture of the war, but it certainly was a humiliating blow to Putin. I mean, that surely we can agree on.
I'm sure it was humiliating, but humiliation means virtually nothing in how this war turns out. You can humiliate Putin every day of the week, and it's not going to have any effect on the battlefield. And what happens on the battlefield is what matters here.
What is happening on the battlefield in your estimation? People say Ukraine, through this drone attack, is showing that it has the resolve and indeed the technical expertise to potentially repel Russia for a lot longer than people thought. Others think that the scale of Russia's attacks since that drone attack suggest they're going to move very aggressively now through the summer to try and exploit the better weather conditions and to really get a grip of this war. What's your assessment?
Well, I think if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, the Russians are gaining more and more territory every day, and they're destroying more and more Ukrainian forces. And if you look at the underlying balance of power, it's clear, even from Western sources, that the Ukrainians are in really deep trouble. The Royal United Services Institute in London put out a study in February of this year, and if you look at the numbers carefully, it's quite clear that the Ukrainians are outnumbered at least 3-1, maybe 3.5-1 on the front lines. If you look at the amount of artillery on both sides, you look at the number of drones on both sides, and you take into account the fact that the Russians have these smart bombs that are doing massive amounts of destruction to frontline forces on the Ukrainian side, it's hard to imagine how the Russians don't win this war. It may take them longer than some people think is the case, but nevertheless, the Russians are going to prevail in the end. And you want to remember, Piers, at the same time, the Trump administration is basically withdrawing its support for Ukraine. So the long-term future for Ukraine is very bleak.
What does victory look like to Russia? What are they actually trying to achieve here? Some think they're making a play now to take over the whole of Ukraine. Others think they may even expand and attack Moldova, for example. Others think that actually they've always just wanted this southeast corridor. They believe that is what they need to protect themselves from, as they see it, the NATO encroachment in recent years. What is your view of what the actual end game looks like for Russia?
Well, I don't think they're going to take over all of Ukraine. First of all, they need hundreds of thousands more forces to do that, because you want to understand that once they began to move into Western Ukraine, assuming they were able to conquer that, they'd need huge numbers of troops to deal with the insurrection that surely would ensue. I think they will stay out of the western half of Ukraine because it would be a hornet's nest. And again, they don't have the forces to do that. I think they now control about 20% of Ukraine, 4 oblasts plus Crimea. And I think the great danger is that if we don't settle the war now, they'll end up taking 4, 5, maybe even 6 more oblasts. And Ukraine will end up losing close to 40% of its territory instead of 20%. So I think, and I've argued this for a long time, that it's in Ukraine's interest to settle this one immediately, accept the fact that they've lost about 20% of their territory, but go to great lengths to prevent losing more territory.
Right, but how do they do that? Because they lost Crimea, and then we had all the reassurances from Russia that they wouldn't want any more of Ukraine, and then there we were, 2022, they attack mainland Ukraine, and they've now seized 20% of it, as you say. Why would Ukraine trust Russia as far as it could throw it in terms of doing any kind of settlement, which allowed Russia potentially to just come back and attack again down the road, as it did after Crimea?
The thing is that the Russians have made it clear that they would like to settle this war. And they have a set of terms that they're demanding that the Ukrainians and the West agree to. I think it's quite clear that if the Ukrainians and the West agree to those terms, and I could lay them out for you, that the Russians would end the war and settle with 20%, because the terms that the Russians want would leave them in a secure position and they would have no incentive to take more territory. The problem, though, is there's no way the Ukrainians or the West will accept Russia's terms. This is why you can't get any kind of meaningful peace agreement, and it's also why the Russians won't agree to a ceasefire. So this war is going to be settled on the battlefield, and the end result is, I think, will happen is that Ukraine will end up losing more territory. But it's in large part, just to reiterate what I'm saying, because the political terms that the Russians are demanding are unacceptable to the Ukrainians.
In terms of Donald Trump's position on this, he famously said, of course, he would resolve all this in one day. That day came and went very quickly with no resolution. He now has said that Putin's gone absolutely crazy and is playing with fire. I think Putin has to be careful with Trump. Trump can be an unpredictable player in these situations. If he feels like Putin is basically trying to embarrass Trump by ignoring everything that he says, I could see Trump doing something that may surprise people.
I think, Piers, up until June 1st, there was a lot of support for what you are saying. I think after the attacks on June 1st, and here we're emphasizing the Ukrainian attacks on Russia's strategic nuclear forces, Trump came to understand that we're playing with fire here, that striking at Russian nuclear forces was very dangerous and very foolish. And Trump had, on June 4th, this is 3 days after the June 1st attacks, he had an hour and 15-minute conversation with Putin. That's a relatively short conversation when you take into account translations. And at the end, when Trump posted on Truth Social, he said that the two of them had a good conversation and that he understood that the Russians were going to retaliate against Ukraine in a really serious way. Now, Trump usually says when he has a conversation with anybody, certainly with somebody like Trump, with somebody like Putin, that it's a wonderful conversation. He's very positive. Trump's report of the conversation was not very positive, and he said that he understood the Russians were going to attack Ukraine in a serious way as a result of what happened on June 1st. And Trump did not say that was unacceptable. I think, based on what we've seen since June 1st, is that Trump has changed his tune. He understands the Ukrainians are going to lose, and he understands supporting the Ukrainians when they pursue policies like they did on June 1st when they attacked those strategic bombers is not good for the United States. So I think that Donald Trump is slowly but steadily moving away from the Ukrainians and the Europeans, and he's getting closer to Putin.
The one thing I would say back at that, which may contradict what you just said, is that very unusually, Trump did not condemn what Ukraine did on June the 1st. He actually
highlighting
very
a shocking
noticeably
political
did
contradiction.
not.
The U.S. president refuses to criticize Ukraine's provocative attacks, signaling murky loyalties and shifting alliances.
Which suggests that he didn't really have that big a problem with what Ukraine did.
Well, I don't think he wanted to humiliate Ukraine, but I think more importantly,
Well, it's never stopped him before.
told,
I mean, look, this is a guy who's humiliated the president of Ukraine in the Oval Office. I don't think he's worried about humiliating him. It just seemed to me that it was very noticeable that the president of the United States did not condemn that attack right into the heartland of Russia on, as you say, very sensitive military aircraft.
No, I think what's more important, Piers, is that he said that the United States had nothing to do with it. He went to great lengths to distance the United States from that attack because he understands full well. Keith Kellogg understands full well. His former national security advisor, Mike Flynn, understands full well that this was a remarkably foolish move on the part of the Ukrainians. And it was not in the American national interest for an ally of ours like Ukraine to attack strategic nuclear forces belonging to Russia. So I think what you see here is Trump distancing himself from the Ukrainians, not supporting them in any
All right, but let me throw
way.
a little spanner in the works of your argument, which is whenever things get a bit hot or red lines get crossed, Putin tends to start rattling his nuclear saber. And everyone knows he's got 6,000 nuclear warheads and that NATO collectively has more, actually, but America has slightly less than that. But he also understands the principle of MAD, mutually assured destruction. And I've never thought there is a cat in hell's chance of Vladimir Putin launching a nuclear strike at anybody, because the first thing that would happen was that he'd be dead. Within seconds, there would be a retaliatory strike that would kill him. And Vladimir Putin, nothing about his life has been anything other than amassing material goods to enrich himself. Why would a guy like that want to vaporize himself in seconds? So I've never believed any of his threats to use nuclear weapons. And there's certainly no suggestion from credible people that he's thinking of doing so now. So why was it such a mistake for Ukraine to launch such an incredibly audacious attack, which was so successful, which humiliated Putin and made people realize that maybe Ukraine aren't finished after all?
Just again, Piers, this was not so successful. These are the kind of arguments that people in the West...
Well, billions of dollars of planes were blown up by drones that were put on trucks right into the heart of Russia. How could that not be a success?
I don't believe that as many planes as you said
apparently
were
it was
blown
24.
up.
I heard it was 2 dozen. I heard it was 2 dozen reported, I think, in the New York Times, and each one was worth $100 million.
I don't believe that. But even if you're right, it doesn't matter on the overall course of the war. The question is, what effect is this going to have on the battlefield? And the answer is, it's not going to have any effect on the battlefield. It's just a public relations stunt. That's what it is. But there's one side effect, and that is that they hit the strategic nuclear forces of Russia. Now, you say this doesn't matter at all because Putin would never use nuclear weapons.
Right.
You can't know that. You can't know what will happen
But why
in a
would
future
he?
crisis.
Why would he?
And given this, why would what?
Why would he use nuclear weapons, given that he would immediately get vaporized?
Because he would not immediately get vaporized. He could use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
A bombshell
and we
claim
would
that
not
Western nuclear
retaliate.
deterrence might not protect Ukraine, unraveling traditional assumptions about escalation and defense.
You
And
think
Ukraine
Russia,
has no
Russia could
nuclear
use
weapons of its own.
hang on. You think Russia could use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine and America would just stand by and let that happen? That NATO would stand by and let that happen? They would allow a Russian dictator to use nuclear weapons on a European sovereign country?
I certainly believe that. We are not going to use nuclear weapons if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Of course we are.
I don't know anybody who argues, because yes, we'd get incinerated. The logic that
So
you
would
laid out
they.
a
That's
minute
the whole
ago would
principle.
apply to us.
Yeah, but the whole point of MAD.
No, they wouldn't.
Well, the whole point of MAD is that both sides understand if somebody pressed that button, everyone gets incinerated. That's the point of it, mutually assured destruction. That's why no one uses them.
No, that's not the way. No, that's not the way it works when it comes to Ukraine. Ukraine has no nuclear weapons of its own. The Russians can use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. They cannot retaliate, and we would not initiate nuclear use against Russia in response because we
This
would
searing
end up
dialogue
getting
reveals the grim
incinerated.
strategic realities behind Ukraine's bold drone attacks and Russia's ominous nuclear shadow. With Western powers caught between supporting Kyiv and avoiding direct conflict, the risks are profound. Will the U.S. pull back? Could Putin's next move ignite a broader catastrophe? What happens if nuclear weapons enter the battlefield? These questions demand urgent answers. Drop your take below and join the debate.